The year was 1885, and life in Arizona Territory was harder than a stone. Samuel Hartwell sat in his tiny cabin, listening to the wind howl like an angry beast outside. The storm had been building all day, and now it was here with full force. Rain hammered against his roof, finding every crack and leak that Samuel couldn't afford to fix. He looked around his home with tired eyes. The fireplace barely had enough wood to keep burning. His shelves were almost empty. Just some dried beans and a bit of salted meat left. His cattle had gotten sick months ago, and most of them died. The drought before that had killed his crops. Now Samuel was hanging on by a thread, trying to keep his small ranch from disappearing completely. Thunder crashed so loud it shook the walls. Samuel pulled his worn blanket tighter around his shoulders. He was thinking about what he'd do tomorrow. Maybe he could find some work in town. Maybe he could trade something for food. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound that made his blood run cold. Someone was screaming outside. At first, Samuel thought it was just the wind playing tricks. But then he heard it again, a human voice calling out in pain or fear. His heart started pounding. Going outside in this storm was dangerous. But someone was out there and they needed help. Samuel grabbed his old coat and pushed open the door. The wind almost tore it from his hands. Rain hit his face like tiny needles. He held up his lantern, but the light barely cut through the darkness and rain. Then he saw them. Two figures were collapsed near the edge of his property. Samuel rushed over, his boots sinking into the mud. When he got closer, his eyes went wide with shock. These weren't ordinary travelers. They were Apache women, and they were huge. Both of them were taller than any woman Samuel had ever seen, probably over 6 feet. Even lying on the ground, sick and weak, they looked incredibly strong. The women were shivering violently. Their clothes were soaked through. Samuel could see they had high fevers from the way their skin looked and how they were breathing. One of them, who seemed a bit older, opened her eyes and looked at Samuel. There was fear in those eyes. She probably thought he would hurt them or turn them away. Samuel knew what most people would do. The relationship between settlers and Apache people was terrible. There had been fighting, hatred, and bloodshed on both sides. Many ranchers would have left these women to die or worse. Some would have turned them into the army. Samuel had heard all the stories about Apache raids. He'd been taught to fear them. But looking at these two sisters dying in the mud outside his home, Samuel didn't see enemies. He saw two human beings who desperately needed help. He made his decision in a heartbeat. Samuel bent down and tried to help the older woman sit up. She was heavy with muscle, and it took all his strength. He managed to get his arm under her shoulders and started dragging her toward his cabin. The younger sister was barely conscious, but she saw what Samuel was doing. Confusion crossed her face. Why was this white rancher helping them? Getting both women inside took almost everything Samuel had. He was a small man, thin from not eating enough, and these sisters were tall and solid. He slipped in the mud twice. His back screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. He got the first sister through his door, then went back for the second one. Finally, both women were inside his cabin. Samuel quickly shut the door against the storm. Water dripped everywhere, creating puddles on his wooden floor. The women were still shivering uncontrollably. Samuel knew what fever like this could do. Without help, they might not survive the night. He threw more wood on the fire, even though he was supposed to be saving it. He grabbed his only 2 blankets and wrapped them around the sisters. Then he got his water bucket and a cloth. He started wiping the mud and rain from their faces. The women watched him with eyes that showed both gratitude and disbelief. Samuel went to his shelf and took down his precious supply of dried herbs that he used for medicine. He made a tea that his mother had taught him about when he was young. It was supposed to help with fever. He carefully helped each woman drink some. They winced at the bitter taste, but they drank it. Throughout the long night, Samuel stayed awake. He kept the fire going. He changed the cool cloths on their foreheads when they got warm. He gave them more water whenever they could drink. His own stomach was growling with hunger, but he didn't eat. He needed to save what little food he had in case the sisters needed it when they woke up. The older sister started talking in her sleep. Samuel couldn't understand the Apache language, but he could hear the fear and pain in her voice. She was having bad dreams. Samuel did something without thinking. He reached over and gently patted her hand, the way his mother used to comfort him when he was sick as a child. The woman's eyes opened slightly. She looked at Samuel's weathered, kind face in the firelight. Then she looked down at his hand on hers. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Samuel gave her a small, tired smile. She squeezed his hand weakly before closing her eyes again. This time, she slept more peacefully. As the storm raged outside, Samuel sat between these two giant strangers in his tiny, poor cabin. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to change his life forever. He didn't know that these weren't just any Apache women. He didn't know that their father was one of the most powerful chiefs in the territory. He only knew that they were suffering, and he had a choice to make. Samuel Hartwell had chosen compassion over fear. He'd chosen humanity over hatred. And though he sat there exhausted, hungry, and worried, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he'd done something right. The fire crackled softly as rain continued to pound the roof. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But tonight, three souls who should have been enemies found unexpected shelter together. And sometimes that's how the best stories begin. Not with great plans or noble speeches, but with one person simply deciding to help another person in need, no matter what anyone else might think. Morning came slowly, with weak sunlight pushing through the clouds. The storm had finally passed, leaving everything outside wet and muddy. Inside Samuel's cabin, the two Apache sisters were still alive, and that was something to be grateful for. Samuel had dozed off in his chair around dawn, but he woke up quickly when he heard movement. The older sister was sitting up, looking around the cabin with sharp, intelligent eyes. When she saw Samuel watching her, she went very still. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Samuel slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. Then he pointed to himself and said his name clearly. Samuel. He repeated it twice more, hoping she would understand. The woman studied him carefully. Then she touched her own chest and said something in Apache. It sounded like Nalan. Samuel tried to repeat it, and though he probably said it wrong, a small smile appeared on her face. It was a start. The younger sister woke up next. She looked even more scared than Nalan, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Nalan spoke to her in their language, probably telling her it was okay. The younger one touched her chest and said what sounded like Aida. Samuel repeated that name too, and both sisters seemed to relax just a little bit. Samuel stood up slowly so he wouldn't startle them. He walked over to his nearly empty shelf and pulled down some dried meat and his last bit of bread. It wasn't much. Actually, it was supposed to be his food for the next 3 days, but these women needed it more than he did right now. He brought the food over and offered it to them. Nalan and Aida looked at the food, then at Samuel, then back at the food. They seemed confused. Samuel used gestures to show them they should eat. He pretended to eat, rubbed his stomach, and smiled. Finally, Nalan took a small piece of meat. When Samuel nodded encouragingly, she ate it. Aida did the same. While they ate, Samuel noticed how they looked at everything in his cabin. They saw the holes in his clothes. They saw the empty shelves. They saw where the roof leaked, with buckets placed underneath to catch the drips. These women might not speak his language, but they could clearly see that Samuel was a poor man. Yet he had saved them and was now feeding them his last food. After eating, Nalan tried to communicate something important. She started using hand signals and gestures, acting things out like a story. Samuel watched carefully, trying to understand. She made walking motions with her fingers. Then she showed many people walking together in a line. Her face became sad and angry. She showed people falling down, showed exhaustion and heat. Samuel began to understand. The Apache people were being forced to move by the government. He'd heard about it. They called them relocations, but really they were forcing native people to leave their lands and walk to reservations far away. Many died on these marches from heat, hunger, and sickness. Nalan continued her story. She showed how she and Aida had somehow gotten separated from their group. Maybe they'd gotten sick and fallen behind. Maybe they'd been out hunting for food. Samuel couldn't tell exactly how it happened, but these two sisters had been wandering alone for days. No food, no water, nothing. Until the storm hit and they collapsed near his property. Samuel felt his heart break a little. These proud, strong women had been through so much. And here he was, just a struggling rancher who barely had enough to feed himself. But looking at them, he knew he'd made the right choice. He went outside to his well and brought back fresh water. He gave them his own cup to share. The water was cool and clean, and both sisters drank deeply. Aida said something in Apache, and though Samuel didn't know the words, the gratitude in her voice was clear as day. Throughout the day, Samuel did what little he could to make them comfortable. He found some clothes that had belonged to his wife before she left to care for her sick mother in another town. The clothes were too small for these tall women, but at least they were dry. He heated more water so they could wash up. He made more of his fever medicine, even though his supply was running dangerously low. The sisters' health was improving, but slowly. They still needed rest. Samuel made sure they stayed warm by the fire. When afternoon came, he realized he was getting hungry himself. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. His stomach was making noises, but he ignored it. The sisters needed food more, Nalin noticed. This woman didn't miss much. She saw Samuel's hand go to his stomach. She saw him look at the empty shelf where the food had been. Understanding crossed her face. She spoke to Aida urgently in Apache. Aida looked upset, maybe guilty. Nalin stood up, though she was still weak. She walked over to Samuel and did something unexpected. She placed both her hands on his shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. Then she spoke in Apache, her voice strong and serious. Samuel didn't know what the words meant, but he felt the weight of them. This was important. This was some kind of promise or blessing. Then Nalin did something that made Samuel's eyes water. She took off a small leather pouch that hung around her neck. It looked old and precious, probably something that meant a lot to her. She tried to give it to Samuel. He shook his head no and gently pushed it back toward her. He didn't want payment. He didn't want thanks. He'd just done what any decent person should do, but Nalin wouldn't take no for an answer. She pressed the pouch into Samuel's hand and closed his fingers around it. Her eyes were fierce and determined. This wasn't just a gift. This was something deeper. Samuel finally nodded and accepted it, knowing it would be an insult to refuse. As evening approached, Samuel could tell the sisters were getting restless. They kept looking at the door, at the darkening sky. They were worried about something. Samuel understood. They needed to find their people. They needed to get home, wherever home was now for them. Samuel wished he could tell them to stay longer, to rest more. But he also knew they had to go. He gathered what little food he had left and wrapped it in cloth. He gave it to them for their journey. Nalin shook her head, refusing, but Samuel insisted just as firmly as she had with the pouch. The sisters prepared to leave as darkness fell. Before they went to the door, both Nalin and Aida came to stand before Samuel. Together they made a gesture. They placed their right hands over their hearts, then extended those hands toward Samuel, palms up. Then they bowed their heads slightly. Samuel didn't know Apache customs, but he knew he was witnessing something special. This was a gesture of deep respect and gratitude. Samuel copied the gesture back to them, hoping he was doing it right. When he looked up, both sisters were smiling. Real warm smiles that lit up their faces. For just a moment, the hardship and fear disappeared. And they were just three people who had connected across a divide that was supposed to be impossible to cross. Then Nalin and Aida slipped out into the night. Samuel stood in his doorway, watching their tall figures disappear into the darkness. The night was quiet now, peaceful after the storm. Samuel touched the leather pouch hanging around his neck. He wondered if he would ever see those remarkable women again. He had no idea that he would see them again much sooner than he thought. And when he did, they wouldn't be alone. They'd be bringing someone very important with them. Someone who would change Samuel's life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. But that night, Samuel just closed his door, sat down in his empty cabin and smiled despite his hunger and poverty. He'd done something good, and sometimes that's worth more than a full belly or a heavy purse. Samuel woke up to a feeling that something was wrong. It was too quiet. Even the birds weren't singing. He sat up in bed, his heart already starting to beat faster. Something in the air felt different, tense, like the moment before lightning strikes. He got dressed quickly and walked to his window. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. His property was completely surrounded by Apache warriors. There had to be at least 30 of them, maybe more. They sat on horses in a wide circle around his cabin, silent as shadows. Every single one of them was armed. Samuel could see bows, rifles, and knives glinting in the early morning sun. For a moment, Samuel couldn't breathe. His legs felt weak. This was it. This was how he was going to die. Maybe someone had seen him helping Nalin and Aida. Maybe the Apache thought he'd hurt them or kidnapped them. Maybe they were here for revenge. Samuel thought about trying to run out the back, but he knew it was useless. These warriors could track a mouse through a forest. There was nowhere to go. His hands were shaking as he opened his front door. If this was the end, he'd face it standing up, not hiding like a coward. The morning air was cool against his face as he stepped outside. The warriors watched him but didn't move. Then the circle parted, and a single rider came through. Samuel knew immediately that this man was someone important. The rider was older, maybe in his 50s, with long gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with symbols Samuel didn't understand. But it was his eyes that caught Samuel's attention. They were dark, deep, and sharp. Eyes that had seen too much war, too much death, too much suffering. This was a man who had led his people through impossible times. The chief dismounted with the grace of someone half his age. He was tall and powerfully built, walking with the confidence of a man who had never backed down from anything. He came to stand directly in front of Samuel, so close that Samuel could see the old scars on his face and arms. Battle scars. This man was a warrior. Another Apache man stepped forward, younger than the chief. "I speak English," he said. "Chief Mangas will talk through me." Mangas. Samuel had heard that name before. Everyone in the territory had. Chief Mangas was a legend, a leader who had fought the Mexican army and the American army both. A man who had watched his people be killed, his lands stolen, his way of life destroyed. Some said he was fierce and cruel. Others said he was wise and just. Looking at him now, Samuel thought maybe he was all of those things. The chief spoke in Apache, his voice deep and commanding. The translator turned to Samuel. "Chief Mangas says you helped 2 women during the storm. 2 Apache women." Samuel swallowed hard. His mouth was so dry he could barely speak. "Yes," he managed to say. "They were sick, dying. I couldn't just leave them." The translator spoke to Mangas, who listened without any expression on his face. Then the chief said something else, longer this time. The translator turned back to Samuel. "Those women are his daughters, Nalin and Ayita. They are very important to our people. The chief's daughters." When they did not return to the camp, many warriors went looking for them. They finally found them yesterday, and the daughters told their father everything. They told him about the poor white rancher who saved their lives. They told him you gave them your last food, your only blankets. They told him you expected nothing in return. Samuel felt a tiny bit of relief. At least Nalin and Ayita were safe. At least the chief knew he hadn't hurt them. But he still didn't know if he was in trouble. The chief's face showed nothing. Mangas stepped even closer. He looked Samuel up and down, taking in every detail. Samuel's worn-out boots with holes in them, his thin frame from not eating enough, his patched clothes. The chief's eyes moved past Samuel to look at the cabin. Samuel knew what he was seeing. A roof that leaked, walls that needed repair, a ranch that was barely surviving. The chief spoke again, and this time his voice sounded different, not quite as hard. The translator said, "Chief Mangas wants to know why you helped his daughters. You are poor. You had nothing to give. Many white men hate Apache people. Why did you risk your life for strangers?" This was the moment. Samuel took a deep breath. He decided to speak from his heart, to tell the truth. "I helped them because they needed help," he said simply. "I saw 2 people dying in the rain. I didn't see Apache or white or anything else. I just saw people who were suffering. My mother taught me that we help those who need it, no matter who they are, even if we don't have much to give." The translator spoke to the chief. Mangas listened, and for the first time something changed in his expression. His eyes softened just a tiny bit. He looked at Samuel for a long moment, like he was looking into his soul, trying to see if his words were true. Then Chief Mangas did something Samuel didn't expect. He placed his right hand over his heart, then extended it toward Samuel, palm up. It was the same gesture Nalin and Ayita had made, the gesture of respect. The chief spoke, and his words through the translator were formal and important. In Apache tradition, When someone saves a life, they create a sacred bond. You save not one life, but two. You save the daughters of a chief. This is not something small. This is something that demands recognition. Samuel started to say it was okay, that he didn't need anything, but Mangas held up his hand for silence. The chief continued speaking. You showed courage. Not the courage of fighting, but the courage of doing what is right when it would be easier to do nothing. You showed generosity when you had nothing to give. You showed humanity when others show only hatred. These are the values my people respect. These are the values of a true warrior, even if you have never held a weapon. The translator paused as Mangas said something else, something that seemed very important. Chief Mangas says that you have shown the character of a good man. He says saving his daughters creates a debt that must be repaid. This is about honor. In Apache culture, generosity must be answered with generosity. Help must be answered with help. Samuel felt overwhelmed. I don't want payment, he said. I didn't help them to get something back. I helped them because it was the right thing to do. The chief listened to the translation and actually smiled slightly. He said something that almost sounded like approval. The translator said, the chief respects your words, but he says this is not about what you want. This is about what honor demands. You gave everything you had to strangers. Now those strangers will help you. This is the Apache way. To refuse would be to insult the chief's honor and the honor of his daughters. Samuel didn't know what to say. He looked at the chief's serious face. He looked at all the warriors surrounding his property. He understood that this wasn't really a choice. This was something deeper than a simple thank you. This was about respect, about tradition, about a code of honor that Samuel was only beginning to understand. I accept, Samuel said quietly, and I'm honored. Chief Mangas nodded once sharply. Then he said something that made all the warriors respond with a unified sound of agreement. The translator smiled. The chief says that starting tomorrow, his people will come to help rebuild your ranch. He says they will teach you the old ways of living on this land. He says you have earned the friendship of the Apache people, which is not given lightly. Then the chief did one more thing. He reached out and placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder. It was a gesture of respect between equals. Samuel felt the weight of that hand, the strength in it, but also the gentleness. This man could have killed him easily. Instead, he was offering friendship. As the warriors began to leave, Samuel stood there feeling like the world had turned upside down. Yesterday he was alone, poor and struggling. Today he had somehow become friends with one of the most powerful Apache chiefs in the territory. And tomorrow, his life was going to change in ways he couldn't even imagine yet. He touched the leather pouch that still hung around his neck, the gift from Nayland. Now he understood what it really meant. It wasn't just a thank you, it was a promise that had just been kept. The next morning, Samuel woke up early, still not quite believing what had happened yesterday. He wondered if maybe he'd dreamed the whole thing. But when he looked out his window and saw a group of Apache men walking toward his property, he knew it was all real. There were about 10 of them, led by a man who looked to be in his 30s. They carried tools, supplies, and materials that Samuel couldn't even afford to dream about. The leader approached Samuel's door and knocked. When Samuel opened it, the man nodded respectfully. I am Taza, the man said in clear English. Chief Mangas sent us. We are here to help fix your ranch. Samuel invited them in, feeling awkward and unsure. He'd never had Apache people in his home before yesterday. He'd certainly never had a group of warriors offering to help him work. But Taza and his men were calm and friendly. They looked around the cabin, not with judgment, but with the eyes of people figuring out what needed to be done. Taza pointed at the roof. We fix that first. Rain will come again. You need a good roof. He pointed at the broken fence posts Samuel could see through the window. Then we fix those. Your animals need good fences. He turned to Samuel. You have tools? Samuel felt embarrassed. Just a hammer and a saw. They're pretty old. Taza nodded like he'd expected that. We brought tools. We brought wood. The chief said you need help, so we bring everything. And just like that, the work began. Samuel had never seen people work like these Apache men. They moved with purpose and efficiency. No wasted motion, no complaining. Some climbed onto his roof and started removing the old rotted sections. Others began cutting new wood to the right size. A few started working on the fence posts. digging new holes where the old posts had rotted away. Samuel tried to keep up, but honestly, he was amazed. These men knew what they were doing. They'd clearly built and repaired many structures in their lives, and they worked as a team, communicating with few words, everyone knowing their role. By midday, Samuel's roof was half repaired. The difference was incredible. He could actually see how it was supposed to look. Taza came down from the roof, wiping sweat from his face. "You have water?" he asked. Samuel brought out water for everyone. As the men rested and drank, Taza sat with Samuel. "Chief Mangas told us about you," Taza said. "He said you are a good man. He said you saved his daughters with your last food, your last blanket. This is why we help. Not because we have to, because we want to." Samuel felt his throat get tight with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. Taza shook his head. "You don't thank us. We thank you. You could have left Nalan and Aita to die. Most white men would have. You didn't. You saw people who needed help and you helped. That is rare. That is worth respecting." That afternoon, something wonderful happened. More Apache people arrived, but this time it wasn't just men. Women came too, and even some children. And with them came Nalan and Aita. The two sisters looked completely different from when Samuel had last seen them. They were healthy now, strong, dressed in beautiful traditional clothing. When they saw Samuel, their faces lit up with genuine happiness. They came right over to him, and both of them hugged him. Samuel was surprised but hugged them back. Through Taza, who was translating, Nalan said, "We told our father you are a good man. We told him you gave everything to help us. He believes us. Now the whole tribe knows about you. You are famous among our people." Aita spoke too. "We brought gifts. Not payment. Gifts from grateful hearts. The women had brought food. Real food. Fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and things Samuel hadn't eaten in months. They also brought blankets, thick and warm. Much better than the thin ones Samuel had given them. One old woman brought medicine herbs and showed Samuel how to use them properly. The children ran around his property, laughing and playing, bringing life to a place that had been lonely for so long. As the day went on, Samuel learned so much. The Apache people taught him their techniques for building. They showed him how to weave certain materials together to make a roof that would last years instead of months. They taught him how to set fence posts so they wouldn't rot as quickly. They showed him efficient ways to do tasks that Samuel had been struggling with for years. But more than the practical lessons, Samuel was learning something else. He was learning that everything he'd been told about Apache people was wrong. They weren't savages. They weren't mindless or cruel. They were intelligent, skilled, kind, and had a strong sense of community. They took care of each other. They honored their word. They valued generosity and courage. Around evening, Chief Mangas himself arrived. He rode up on a beautiful horse and dismounted with that same powerful grace Samuel had seen before. The chief walked around the property, inspecting the work that had been done. He nodded with approval. Through Taza, the chief spoke to Samuel. "Your roof will be done tomorrow. Your fences will be strong again. But this is just the beginning. My people will teach you how to live on this land the way we have for generations. We will teach you how to find water when the land is dry. We will teach you which plants grow best in drought. We will teach you how to read the weather and the animals." Samuel was overwhelmed. "Chief Mangas, this is too much. I can never repay all of this." The chief's stern face softened slightly. He spoke, and Taza translated carefully. "You already repaid it. You gave everything you had to save my daughters. You ask for nothing. You expect nothing. That is true generosity. What we do now is not repayment. It is recognition. We recognize you as a man of honor. Such men deserve to prosper." Then the chief said something that really surprised Samuel. "You are also teaching us something. You show us that not all white men are the same. Not all settlers want to take and destroy. Some, like you, still have honor, still have humanity. This gives us hope. Hope is precious in these dark times." Samuel felt tears trying to come, but he held them back. "I just want to say, Chief, that I'm learning too. I was taught that your people were different, dangerous, but I see now that I was taught wrong. Your people are good people. You have honor and kindness and wisdom. I'm sorry for ever believing the lies," Taza translated. And Chief Mangas looked at Samuel for a long moment. Then the chief placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder again. He spoke one word in Apache, then said it in English. "Friend." That evening, the Apache people had a small celebration at Samuel's ranch. They built a fire and cooked food. They told stories, though Samuel could only understand the ones that Taza translated. The children taught Samuel a game they played. The women showed him patterns they wove into blankets. The men talked about hunting and tracking. Samuel sat there among them, eating good food, listening to laughter, feeling the warmth of community for the first time in years. He looked at his cabin with its new roof. He looked at his repaired fences. He looked at the faces around the fire, faces that had become friendly instead of frightening. And he realized something important. He'd saved 2 lives during that storm, but maybe in a way they'd saved his life too. They'd saved him from loneliness. They'd saved him from failure. They'd saved him from the hatred and fear that poisoned so many hearts. As the stars came out above them, Samuel made a silent promise. He would honor this gift he'd been given. He would learn everything these people wanted to teach him. He would be a bridge, showing other settlers that Apache people deserved respect, not hatred. He would be worthy of the friendship Chief Mangas had offered. Across the fire, Chief Mangas caught Samuel's eye. The old chief nodded slightly, like he knew what Samuel was thinking, like he approved. And in that moment, Samuel understood that this wasn't just about fixing a ranch. This was about fixing something much bigger. This was about proving that people from different worlds could find common ground. That understanding was possible. That friendship could grow where only fear had existed before. The fire crackled softly as night deepened. Tomorrow would bring more work, more lessons, more growth. But tonight, Samuel went to sleep with a full stomach, a warm blanket, and something more valuable than gold. He went to sleep with hope. 3 weeks had passed since that first morning when Taza and his men arrived, and Samuel's ranch looked like a completely different place. The roof was solid and didn't leak anymore. The fences stood straight and strong. The whole property had a sense of order and care that it hadn't had in years, but the physical changes were only part of the story. The bigger transformation was happening in Samuel's understanding of the world and his place in it. Every day, Apache men, women, and sometimes children would arrive at his ranch. They came to work, to teach, and slowly to become friends. Taza was there almost every day, and he'd become something like a brother to Samuel. They worked side by side, and Taza never got tired of answering Samuel's endless questions. "Why do you dig the irrigation channels in that pattern?" Samuel would ask. Taza would smile patiently and explain, "Water is precious in this land. It doesn't rain often, so when it does rain, we must catch every drop and move it where we need it. This pattern helps water reach all the plants without wasting any. My grandfather taught me. His grandfather taught him. This knowledge is very old," and Samuel would watch carefully, memorizing every detail, trying to understand not just what to do, but why. The Apache way of doing things was different from what he'd learned, but it worked better for this harsh land. These people had lived here for generations. They understood things that settlers like Samuel were still trying to figure out. One of the most important lessons came from an older Apache man named Goyathle. He was a respected elder who knew everything about plants. One morning he arrived with several pouches of seeds and called Samuel over. "Your land is dying because you try to grow the wrong things," Goyathle said through Taza's translation. "You plant seeds that need lots of water, but water is not plenty here. You must plant smart, not hard." Goyathle opened his pouches and showed Samuel different seeds. "These beans, they grow with little water. These squash, they spread their leaves to shade the ground and keep moisture in the soil. These peppers, they actually like the heat. Plant these and your land will feed you. Plant the other things and you will always be hungry." Samuel examined the seeds with fascination. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before?" Goyathle shrugged. "White men don't ask. They think they know better. They try to make the land be like the land they left behind. But land cannot change. People must change. We learned this long ago." Over the next few days, Goyathle and several Apache women helped Samuel plant these new crops. They showed him exactly how deep to plant each seed, how far apart they should be, and how to mulch around them to keep the moisture in. The women sang while they worked, traditional songs that Samuel didn't understand but found beautiful anyway. One of the women working in the garden was Nalan. She and Samuel had become quite comfortable with each other now. She would often laugh at his clumsy attempts to learn Apache words, but it was kind laughter, not mean. She was teaching him their language bit by bit. "This plant is called nadahe," she would say, pointing. Samuel would repeat it, usually getting it wrong, and she would correct him gently. No, Nadahe. The H sound comes from here. And she'd point to her throat. Aita was there too, usually working with the younger children. She was gentler and quieter than her sister, but she had a gift for teaching. She showed Samuel's neighbor's children, who had started coming around out of curiosity, how to weave small baskets from grass. The children were fascinated, and their parents were surprised to see them sitting peacefully with Apache people, learning and laughing. The transformation wasn't just happening on Samuel's land. It was happening in him. He'd started to see the world differently. Before he'd looked at the harsh Arizona desert and seen only difficulty. Now with Apache eyes, he was starting to see beauty and opportunity. He noticed which plants grew in which spots and understood that each plant had chosen that spot for a reason. He watched how water flowed across his land and saw patterns he'd never noticed before. He observed animals and learned to read what their behavior was telling him about weather and seasons. Chief Mangas visited regularly, though not every day. When he came, it was always meaningful. He would walk the property with Samuel, pointing things out, teaching lessons that went beyond just ranching. One afternoon they stood together looking at the newly planted fields. "You learn quickly," the chief said through Taza. "This is good. But I want you to understand something important. We do not give you this knowledge lightly. For many generations, this knowledge kept my people alive in a hard land. We share it with you because you honored us, because you showed respect. Remember this," Samuel nodded seriously. "I will never forget, Chief Mangas, and I will teach my children to respect your people and your ways." The chief seemed satisfied with that answer. "Your woman," he said. "She is still away?" Samuel nodded. His wife had been gone for over a month now, caring for her mother who'd been very sick. "She should be back in another week or two," Samuel said. He was both excited and nervous about her return. How would she react to all these changes? Would she understand? Would she be afraid of the Apache people who were now constantly around their home? As if reading his thoughts, Chief Mangas said, "When she returns, bring her to our camp. Let her meet our people properly. Let her see that we mean no harm. Women understand women. Let her talk to my daughters, to our mothers and grandmothers. Fear goes away when people meet face to face." That made sense to Samuel. He agreed immediately. The children were maybe the most amazing part of the whole transformation. Apache children and the few settler children from nearby ranches were playing together now. At first, both groups had been shy and suspicious. But children are smarter than adults sometimes. They figured out how to communicate through games and laughter. Language didn't matter much when you were racing or playing hide-and-seek. One little Apache boy named Chino had become especially attached to Samuel. He was about 7 years old, curious about everything and always asking questions. He followed Samuel around like a shadow, wanting to help with every task. "Why you do it that way?" Chino would ask in his broken English. "My uncle, he does it different." And Samuel would stop and say, "Show me how your uncle does it." Often Chino's uncle's way was better, and Samuel would switch to doing it that way. This made Chino glow with pride. He'd run off to tell his uncle that Samuel was using his method. The women taught Samuel's small garden to flourish in ways he'd never managed before. They brought knowledge about companion planting, which plants helped each other grow. They showed him natural ways to keep insects away without harsh chemicals. They taught him which wild plants were edible and which were poisonous, which could be used for medicine and which for dyes. One evening, the women prepared a special meal at Samuel's ranch. They wanted to thank him, they said, for being welcoming. They cooked traditional Apache foods, and Samuel tried everything even when he wasn't sure what it was. Some dishes were strange to him, but most were delicious. The women laughed at the faces he made when he tried something particularly spicy or unusual. During that meal, sitting on the ground outside his cabin, surrounded by people who'd been strangers just weeks before, Samuel felt something he'd almost forgotten. He felt like he belonged to a community. For years he'd been isolated, barely talking to his few neighbors, struggling alone. Now his home was full of life, full of voices and laughter, full of purpose. Taza sat next to him, eating and watching the stars come out. "You are different now," Taza observed. "When we first came, you were nervous, unsure. Now you are more confident, more at peace." Samuel thought about that. It was true. "I think I was lost before," he admitted. "Lost and alone. You all found me, showed me a better way." "No," Taza said, shaking his head. "You found yourself. We just helped. The goodness was already in you. That is why you saved Nalan and Ayata. That is why this all happened. Good actions bring good results. This is the balance of the world. As the evening wore on and people started heading back to their camp, Samuel stood at his door watching them go. His ranch was transformed. His crops were growing. His buildings were solid. But more than that, his heart was transformed. He'd learned that the people he was taught to fear were actually people he could learn from, work with, and care about. And the transformation wasn't finished yet. Every day brought new lessons, new friendships, new understanding. Samuel was becoming part of something larger than himself. He was becoming a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed bridges. Tomorrow would bring more work, more learning, more growth. Samuel went to bed that night excited about the future for the first time in years. The transformation had begun and there was no going back. Only forward into a new way of being. 2 months had passed since that stormy night, and Chief Mangas had become a regular visitor to Samuel's ranch. The visits were no longer formal or tense. They'd evolved into something that looked a lot like friendship, though neither man would have said it out loud at first. The chief would arrive on his horse, sometimes alone, sometimes with a few men. He'd walk Samuel's land with him, observing how the crops were growing, checking on the livestock, discussing plans for the future. But more than that, they talked about life, about hardship, about what it meant to be a good man in difficult times. One morning, Chief Mangas arrived earlier than usual. Samuel was surprised to see him carrying what looked like old maps made from animal hide. The chief spread them out on the ground outside Samuel's cabin. "These are the stories of this land," Mangas said through Taza, who'd accompanied him. "My grandfather made these. His grandfather taught him the knowledge. Now I teach you." The maps were incredible. They showed water sources that Samuel never knew existed. They marked places where certain plants grew in abundance. They indicated animal migration paths and seasonal patterns. This was knowledge built up over hundreds of years of careful observation. Mangas pointed to a spot on the map. "Here, under these rocks, water stays even in the driest summer. You can dig a well there. The water is sweet and clean." He traced a line with his finger. "And here the deer pass in late autumn. Not many, but regular. If you are patient, you can hunt here and never go hungry." Samuel studied the maps intently, trying to memorize every detail. "Why are you sharing this with me, Chief? This knowledge must be precious to your people." Mangas looked at him with those deep, weathered eyes. "Knowledge dies if it is not passed on. My people are being pushed away from this land, pushed to places we do not know. Maybe one day no Apache will live here anymore. Maybe this knowledge will be lost forever." He paused. "Unless someone like you remembers it, honors it, keeps it alive." The weight of that statement hit Samuel hard. The chief was trusting him with something irreplaceable. "I will remember," Samuel promised. "And I will teach my children. And they will teach their children. This knowledge will not die." Mangas nodded, satisfied. Then he did something unexpected. He taught Samuel how to read the weather using methods that didn't require any instruments. "See those clouds?" he said, pointing at the sky. "The way they move, the color at the edges, the height. These things tell you what comes tomorrow. White man looks at thermometers and barometers. We look at the sky, the animals, the plants. We are never wrong." Over the next few hours, Mangas taught Samuel to notice things he'd looked at his whole life but never really seen. How certain birds flew lower before rain. How the air smelled different before a storm. How plants closed their leaves when cold weather was coming. How insects behaved differently when the seasons were about to change. "The land speaks to those who listen," Mangas said. "White men are too loud in their heads, too busy thinking about money and property. They do not hear what the land is saying. You must quiet your mind and pay attention." Samuel tried to absorb everything. He felt like a student sitting with a master teacher, which is exactly what he was. This man had survived things Samuel couldn't imagine. He'd led his people through wars, through forced relocations, through the systematic destruction of their way of life. And yet he was still here, still strong, still teaching. As the day went on, their conversation went deeper. Mangas began sharing stories of his people's history, stories that weren't in any history books, stories of how things really happened, not how the government said they happened. "They tell you we are savages who attacked for no reason," Mangas said, his voice heavy with old pain. "They do not tell you how we lived in peace until settlers took our water sources, took our hunting grounds, killed our people for sport. We fought because we had no choice. We fought to survive." Samuel listened, feeling ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for what my people did. For what they're still doing. Mangas shook his head. You are not responsible for what others do. You are only responsible for what you do, and what you did was save my daughters. That is what matters to me. But then the chief's face grew thoughtful. Samuel, I tell you these things because I want you to understand. When other white men are cruel to us, I remember you. When I am angry and want to hate all settlers, I remember there is at least one who has honor. You help me remember that people are individuals. Not all white men are the same, just like not all Apache are the same. That statement revealed something important. Samuel was affecting the chief just as much as the chief was affecting Samuel. They were both learning to see past the surface, past the labels of Apache and settler, to the humans underneath. As they talked, Samuel found himself sharing his own story. He told Mangas about his childhood, about his parents who died young, about his struggles to make something of himself in this harsh territory. He talked about his loneliness, his failures, his fears. Mangas listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything. You and I are not so different, the chief observed. We both know loss. We both know hardship. We both try to do what is right even when it is hard. These things make us brothers even though we come from different worlds. Brothers. The word hung in the air between them. It felt right. They began meeting regularly for these teaching sessions, sometimes at Samuel's ranch, sometimes at the Apache camp where Mangas invited Samuel to visit. The chief taught Samuel about tracking animals, about finding food in the wilderness, about natural medicine that could heal injuries and illnesses. One afternoon, Mangas brought out a beautiful bow. I made this when I was young, he said. I have carried it through many battles. Now I am old and I do not hunt as much. I want you to have it. Samuel was stunned. Chief, I cannot accept this. This is too precious. You saved my daughters, Mangas replied simply. This is a fair trade. Besides, a bow is meant to be used. It wants to sing again. Take it. Samuel accepted the bow with trembling hands. Mangas spent the rest of the afternoon teaching him how to use it properly. Not just how to aim and shoot, but the philosophy behind it. You do not fight with the bow, Mangas explained. You become part of it. You and the bow and the arrow and the target, all are one thing. When you understand this, you cannot miss. It was harder than Samuel expected, but also more rewarding. By the end of the day, he'd managed to hit a target at 20 paces. Mangas nodded with approval. Good, practice every day. I will check your progress. In return, Samuel shared what he knew with Mangas. He taught the chief to read and write in English. Mangas had never learned, having grown up in a time when such skills weren't necessary for Apache people. But now, with treaties and government documents affecting his people's lives, reading had become a survival skill. They sat at Samuel's small table, the chief's weathered hand gripping a pencil awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. Samuel was patient the way Mangas had been patient teaching him to track and hunt. This word is treaty, Samuel would explain. It means an agreement. But Samuel also taught Mangas which words to watch out for, which phrases in contracts meant something different than they seemed to mean. When they write in perpetuity, it means forever. Don't sign anything that says the government can take land in perpetuity without understanding what you're giving up. Mangas absorbed this knowledge grimly. They use words as weapons, he observed. Harder to defend against than arrows. Samuel also shared his books with the chief. He didn't have many, but what he had, he offered. Mangas was particularly interested in maps and geography books. He wanted to understand the whole country, where his people might be sent, what those places were like. One evening, they sat together reading by lamplight. Anyone seeing them would have witnessed something extraordinary. An Apache chief and a white rancher sitting side by side like students, sharing knowledge across a divide that was supposed to be impossible to cross. You know what I think? Samuel said that night. I think if more people did this, sat down and talked and shared, there would be no wars. Most conflicts come from not understanding each other. Mangas smiled sadly. You are right. But understanding requires both sides to want it. Your government does not want to understand. They want to remove us, to erase us. Still, what we do here matters. We prove it is possible. That is something. As the months went on, Samuel's knowledge grew exponentially. He became proficient with the bow. He could track animals almost as well as Apache hunters. He could predict weather with surprising accuracy. He knew which plants healed and which killed. He could find water in the driest places. But more valuable than any practical skill was the wisdom Mangas shared about life itself. How to be patient, how to observe before acting, how to live in harmony with the land instead of trying to dominate it, how to measure wealth not in money but in relationships and experiences. Samuel was becoming someone new. Not white or Apache, but something in between, a bridge, a translator between cultures. And he was grateful for every lesson, every conversation, every moment spent learning from this remarkable man who had become his teacher, his friend, and his brother. Samuel's wife, Elizabeth, had returned home 3 weeks ago. At first, she'd been shocked by all the changes. The repaired ranch, the new crops, and especially the constant presence of Apache people had overwhelmed her. But Samuel had taken her to meet Chief Mangas and his family, just as the chief had suggested. The Apache women, particularly Nalin and Aita, had welcomed her warmly. Slowly, Elizabeth's fear had turned to curiosity and then to friendship. Now she worked alongside the Apache women, learning their methods, sharing meals, laughing together. Samuel's home had become a place where two worlds met peacefully. It was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. Not everyone was happy about it. The trouble started on a hot afternoon in late summer. Samuel was working in his field with Taza and 2 other Apache men when he saw dust rising from the road. A group of riders was approaching. As they got closer, Samuel's stomach tightened. He recognized them, local ranchers from the surrounding properties, and they didn't look friendly. There were 8 of them, led by a man named Crawford. He was a hard man who'd lost his brother to an Apache raid years ago. Since then, his heart had been filled with nothing but hatred. Crawford had never been friendly to Samuel, but he'd mostly left him alone. Until now, the rider stopped at Samuel's fence line. Crawford sat tall in his saddle, his face twisted with anger. "Hartwell," he shouted. "We need to talk to you now." Samuel walked over, his heart pounding but his face calm. "What can I do for you, Crawford?" "You can stop consorting with the enemy, that's what you can do." Crawford's voice was loud, meant to be heard by everyone. "Every day Apache come and go from your property. You're giving them aid and comfort. You're probably giving them information about our ranches too." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "The Apache who come here are friends. They helped me rebuild my ranch when none of you would. They've taught me how to survive in this land. They've never hurt me or anyone else around here." Another rancher, a younger man named Blake, spoke up. "That's not the point. They're Apache. They're dangerous. What happens when they decide to raid our properties? What happens when they use what they learn here to attack us?" "That's not going to happen," Samuel said firmly. "These are good people. They want peace just as much as we do." Crawford laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Good people? They're savages, Hartwell. Your brain has gone soft from spending too much time with them. Or maybe you're just a traitor to your own kind." That word, traitor, hung in the air like poison. Samuel felt Taza and the other Apache men moving closer behind him, ready to defend him if needed. But Samuel held up his hand, signaling them to stay calm. "I'm not a traitor," Samuel said, his voice getting stronger. "I'm just someone who learned to see people as people, not as enemies. The Apache here have shown me nothing but kindness and honor, which is more than I can say for neighbors who ride onto my property hurling accusations." Crawford's face turned red. "You need to choose sides, Hartwell. Either you're with us or you're against us. If you keep allowing Apache onto your land, we'll have to assume you're helping them, and we'll treat you accordingly." The threat was clear. Samuel's mind raced. He knew what accordingly meant. They'd burn his crops, kill his livestock, maybe worse. These men were scared, and scared men did terrible things. Before Samuel could respond, he heard horses approaching from another direction. His heart lifted and sank at the same time. It was Chief Mangas, riding in with about 20 Apache warriors. They must have seen the confrontation from their camp and come to help. The situation had just become much more dangerous. Crawford and his men immediately reached for their weapons. The Apache warriors did the same. Everyone was tense, seconds away from violence. Samuel found himself standing in the middle, literally between 2 groups that were ready to kill each other. "Stop," Samuel shouted loud enough to be heard by everyone. "Everyone stop!" Chief Mangas raised his hand and his warriors froze. Crawford glared but didn't draw his weapon yet. Samuel took a deep breath. This was the moment that would determine everything. "Crawford," Samuel said, turning to face the ranchers. "You said I need to choose sides. But you're wrong. There don't have to be sides. That's the whole problem. We've been taught to see sides, to see enemies when we should be seeing neighbors." "Neighbors?" Crawford spat. These people have killed our families, burned our homes, and white people have done the same to them. Samuel interrupted, his voice passionate. Worse even. We've taken their land, killed their children, forced them from their homes. Both sides have suffered. Both sides have done terrible things. But it doesn't have to keep going like this. He turned to include both groups in his words. Chief Mangas and his people have been coming to my ranch for months. Have they hurt anyone? Have they stolen anything? Have they caused any problems? He waited, but no one answered. No, they haven't. They helped a man who was starving and alone. They shared their knowledge. They treated me with respect and kindness. Blake spoke up, his voice less hostile than Crawford's. But Hartwell, you can't trust them. How do you know they're not just using you? Samuel almost laughed. Using me for what? I had nothing. I was about to lose my ranch. What could they possibly gain from me? He shook his head. No, they helped me because that's who they are. Because when you show them respect, they show you respect back. Because honor matters to them. Chief Mangas spoke then, his voice calm and commanding. Taza translated. The chief says that he did not come here to fight. He came because he saw Samuel surrounded by hostile men. He came to stand with his friend. But he does not want violence. None of his people want violence. We are tired of fighting. We are tired of dying. Mangas continued, and his words carried weight. The chief says his people are being forced to leave this land soon. The government is moving us to a reservation far from here. We do not want to go, but we have no choice. In a few months we will be gone. All we want is to live in peace until that day comes. To hunt, to plant, to raise our children. Is that too much to ask? Some of the ranchers shifted uncomfortably. The reality of the situation was sinking in. The Apache weren't a threat. They were a dying way of life, holding on to their last moments in the land they'd inhabited for generations. Samuel pressed his point. You talk about choosing sides. I choose the side of human decency. I choose the side that says we can live together without killing each other. I choose the side that sees people, not labels. He looked directly at Crawford. You lost your brother. I'm truly sorry for that. The pain of that loss is real. But will more killing bring him back? Will hating all Apache people honor his memory? Crawford's face showed internal struggle. His anger warred with something else, maybe doubt, maybe exhaustion from carrying so much hatred. Samuel continued, softer now. Chief Mangas has become my friend. His daughters, Nalan and Ayita, are like family to me. The Apache children play with Elizabeth and teach her songs in their language. These aren't my enemies. They're my community. And I won't turn my back on them because some people think I should. There was a long silence. The two groups faced each other across Samuel's property. The afternoon sun beat down. Somewhere, a bird called. The tension remained, but something had shifted slightly. Finally, one of the ranchers, an older man named Mr. Thompson, spoke up. Crawford, maybe we should listen to what Hartwell is saying. I've seen Apache riding past my property to come here. They've never bothered me. Never stolen anything. Maybe he's right. Another man nodded. My boy saw him yesterday playing with some Apache kids. Said they were teaching him some kind of game. He came home happy, excited. Didn't seem scared at all. Crawford looked around and saw that his group was wavering. His certainty was the only thing holding their aggression together, and it was cracking. He struggled to maintain control. This is foolishness, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Samuel took a risk. He walked forward until he was standing directly in front of Crawford's horse. Come have dinner with us tonight, he said. Bring your wife. Meet Chief Mangas properly. Talk to him. Listen to his story. Then decide if he's the monster you think he is. What have you got to lose? Crawford stared down at Samuel for a long moment. Everyone held their breath. Finally, Crawford let out a long sigh. I'm not making any promises, he said gruffly. But I'll think about it. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't violence either. It was a crack in the wall, small but significant. One by one, the ranchers turned their horses and rode away. Crawford was the last to leave, giving Samuel a long look that was impossible to read. Then he too turned and left. Samuel's legs felt weak with relief. Chief Mangas rode up beside him and dismounted. That was dangerous, the chief said through Taza. You stood between two groups ready to fight. You could have been hurt. I had to try, Samuel said. This hatred, this cycle of violence, it has to stop somewhere. Why not here? Why not with us? Mangas placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder, that now familiar gesture of respect. You are braver than many warriors I have known. Warriors fight with weapons. You fight with words and truth. That is a different kind of courage. That evening, Samuel and Elizabeth sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were exhausted but also strangely hopeful. 15 years had passed since that stormy night when Samuel found two Apache sisters dying outside his cabin. 15 years of learning, growing, and building bridges where only walls had existed before. Samuel stood in his field, now genuinely prosperous, watching his two sons work alongside Apache young men. The boys, now teenagers, spoke both English and Apache fluently. They moved between both worlds as naturally as breathing. This was the future Samuel and Chief Mangas had dreamed about during those long evenings of conversation and teaching. The ranch had indeed become what Chief Mangas once predicted it might be. A meeting ground. Not just a place where Samuel lived, but a place where understanding happened, where settlers and Apache came together to trade goods, settle disputes peacefully, and simply talk as human beings. After that tense confrontation with Crawford and the other ranchers, things had slowly changed. Crawford himself never did come to dinner, and he never truly let go of his hatred. But many of the other ranchers had started seeing the Apache people differently. Mr. Thompson had been the first to cautiously approach Chief Mangas about trading horses. Then Blake had asked for help finding water on his property, remembering how the Apache had helped Samuel. Small interactions grew into relationships. Relationships grew into trust. Trust grew into a fragile but real peace. The government had tried to force Chief Mangas and his people onto a reservation, as threatened. But Samuel had done something unexpected. He'd used the reading and writing skills he'd taught the chief to help fight back legally. Together, they'd found lawyers who were willing to help. They'd written letters to government officials. They'd documented the peaceful coexistence happening around Samuel's ranch as proof that removal wasn't necessary. It hadn't stopped the relocation completely, but it had delayed it, negotiated better terms, and allowed many Apache families to stay in the general area, rather than being forced hundreds of miles away. It was a small victory, but in those times, small victories were everything. Chief Mangas had grown old, his black hair now completely gray, his strong body moving slower. But his mind remained sharp and his presence still commanded respect. He visited Samuel's ranch at least once a week, usually bringing his granddaughter who loved playing with Samuel's youngest daughter. On this particular afternoon, the chief arrived looking more tired than usual. Samuel immediately brought him water and shade. They sat together on the porch, a ritual they'd performed countless times. "You look troubled, my friend," Samuel said. Mangas nodded slowly. "I am old, Samuel. I feel death coming closer. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And I think about my people, about what happens when I am gone." Samuel felt his throat tighten. He'd known this day would come, but he didn't want to think about it. "You've led your people well, Chief. You've kept them together through impossible times." "Have I?" Mangas asked quietly. "Our numbers are smaller. Our land is smaller. Our way of life is disappearing. Sometimes I wonder if I fought hard enough, if I was wise enough." Samuel leaned forward. "You did more than fight and survive. You taught. You built bridges. You showed that peace was possible. That matters more than you know." The chief looked at Samuel with those deep, weathered eyes. "You are part of my legacy, Samuel. You and your family. What we built here together. I want to ask you something important." "Anything," Samuel said. "When I die, I want you to speak at my memorial ceremony. I have already told my people this." Some were surprised. A white man speaking for an Apache chief? But I insisted. "You understand me better than anyone except my own family. You know what I tried to do, what I tried to build. I want you to tell our story. To remind everyone, Apache and white, that understanding is possible." Samuel felt tears threatening. "It would be an honor, Chief. The greatest honor of my life." Mangas smiled, that rare, warm smile that had become more common over the years. "Good, that settles my heart." They sat in comfortable silence watching the children play. Apache and settler children, running together, laughing together, completely unaware that they were doing something revolutionary. To them, it was just normal. "Do you remember that night?" Mangas asked suddenly. "When you found my daughters?" "Every detail," Samuel said. "I was so scared, so unsure. I almost didn't help them. I almost chose fear over compassion." "But you didn't," Mangas pointed out. "You chose right. That one choice changed everything. For you, for me, for all these children playing here. One choice, one moment of courage, and the world shifts. Samuel understood what the chief was saying. It was a lesson they'd discussed many times. Small acts of courage ripple outward. One person choosing compassion could influence 10 others. Those 10 could influence 100. Change didn't always come through grand gestures or great battles. Sometimes it came through simple human kindness. Nalin and Aida arrived later that afternoon. Both women had married warriors from their tribe and both had children of their own now. They'd grown into respected women in their community, known for their wisdom and strength. But they always made time to visit Samuel. Uncle Samuel, Nalin called out. That's what she called him now, and it always made him smile. She hugged him warmly. Your crops look wonderful. You remembered everything we taught you. I had good teachers, Samuel replied. Aida brought out food she'd prepared, and they all shared a meal together. This too had become normal. Breaking bread together, sharing stories, existing in the same space with comfort and joy rather than fear and suspicion. During the meal, Mangas made an announcement. I have been thinking about the future, about preserving our knowledge. Samuel, you have learned much from us, but it is scattered, remembered, but not written down. I want to create something permanent. A book, perhaps. Something that records our ways, our knowledge about this land. Will you help me write it? Samuel was thrilled. Yes, absolutely. We should start right away, and so they did. Over the next months, Samuel and Mangas worked together to create a record of Apache knowledge about the land. They wrote about water conservation, drought-resistant crops, tracking, weather prediction, natural medicine, and sustainable living. Elizabeth helped too, drawing beautiful illustrations of plants and techniques. The book became known throughout the territory. Ranchers borrowed it. Teachers used it in schools. It became a bridge between traditional knowledge and the new world, ensuring that wisdom built over generations wouldn't be lost forever. 2 years after they completed the book, Chief Mangas passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was surrounded by his family, including Samuel, who'd been summoned when the chief's health began failing. Samuel held his friend's hand in those final hours, and Mangas's last words to him were simple: "Thank you for seeing me as human first." The memorial ceremony was unlike anything the territory had seen before. Hundreds of Apache people gathered, but so did dozens of settlers. People who'd learned to respect the chief through Samuel's example. People who'd slowly come to understand that the Apache weren't their enemies. Samuel stood before this mixed crowd, his heart heavy with grief but also full of gratitude for having known such a remarkable man. He spoke about the night he found Nalin and Aita. He spoke about how one act of kindness had grown into a deep friendship. He spoke about the lessons Mangas taught him, not just about surviving on the land, but about being a good human being. Chief Mangas once told me that he wanted to be remembered not as a warrior, though he was a great one, Samuel said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. He wanted to be remembered as a teacher, as a father, as a bridge builder. He wanted people to know that he tried until his last breath to find peace in a world that seemed determined to have only war. Samuel looked out at the faces before him, Apache and settler, young and old, all listening. He taught me that our differences make us interesting, not inferior. That we can learn from each other without losing who we are. That courage sometimes means putting down your weapon and extending your hand instead. When Samuel finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Even some of the hardened ranchers who'd been skeptical for years were wiping their faces. Nalin came forward and embraced Samuel publicly, a gesture that meant everything to both communities watching. The years continued to pass. Samuel's sons grew into men who served as translators and mediators between Apache and settler communities. They married women from both worlds, further weaving the communities together. His daughter became a teacher who insisted on including Apache history and knowledge in her lessons, something unheard of in most schools. Samuel's ranch remained a gathering place. Every year on the anniversary of Chief Mangas's death, both communities would come together there for a memorial feast. They'd share food, tell stories about the chief, and remember what he stood for. It became tradition, something sacred to both groups. Crawford, the bitter rancher who'd threatened Samuel all those years ago, eventually came around in his own way. He never became friends with Apache people. His grief and anger ran too deep. But he stopped opposing them. He stopped spreading hatred. Near the end of his life, he admitted to Samuel that maybe he'd been wrong. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Samuel himself grew old, he spent his days teaching the next generation. Young ranchers would come to him asking how to work with the land instead of against it.